Welcome to a special emergency edition of Law and Disorder. I'm Charlie Falconer.
I'm Helena Kennedy.
And I'm Nicolás Mostyn.
And this is an emergency to deal with the American use of force to abduct President Maduro from Venezuela. He's now, we understand, in a jail in New York, and the President of the United States of America then says in the meantime he will govern Venezuela. The first question we'd want to ask is this illegal under either international law or US constitutional law? Now, we're spread all over the world at the moment. I'm in St. Lucia, so I'm amongst a lot of Americans and English people on vacation in the Caribbean Sea. I'm probably a few hundred miles from where the abduction took place. And there's a very, very clear divide between the Americans and the English here in St. Lucia. The English are incredibly worried about it. They see it as the beginning of, or a further step towards a lawless world, whereas the Americans are saying Maduro was obviously a very, very bad man. What is the problem in relation to this? And this is Americans right across the political and demographic spectrum. Just before we start, I think, Nicholas, you've got some experience of Caracas. You know Caracas, don't you?
I did. I lived in Caracas. Well, I lived in Caracas. My parents lived in Caracas between 1967 and 1970. My father worked for BAT, Global Corporation, Tobacco Corporation, and Venezuela then was stable and prosperous under Reino and Caldera, and it had not descended into the basket case that it now has.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that it was a complete basket case, and there's very, very considerable doubts about whether President Maduro had legitimately won the last general election, which he was said to have won. And there is absolutely no doubt that the living standards and the life of the people of Venezuela were terrible. Well, are you saying perhaps he did win, Helena, the election?
No, I'm saying the very opposite. I mean, I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, some serious people who were able to get access to the tallies and, you know, the actual voting records and so on in all the different places, and who had been following the elections and observing them. There really is very concrete evidence that he stole the last election and allowed himself to stay in. But the other problem is what happens with authoritarians of every stripe, whether they're right wing or left wing, is that I mean, on the extreme ends of these things, Maduro had captured the judiciary, and the judiciary signed off his having won the election, and so he was able to sort of wave a flag saying, "Look, you know, the judges have looked at this, but actually the judiciary is captured." And I can say that from experience because for some years now, the International Bar Association has been involved with. We did a trial watch for a judge who was put on trial, Lourdes Afiumi, and what happened to her has been a total, I mean, the most terrible thing, where she was convicted. She's been under house arrest ever since, and for years now. And we had a trial watch at the time. Someone from an academic from Columbia went in and watched the trial, and it was an absolute travesty. So, I mean, we're talking about a country that, you know, I mean, let's be clear. Places in
Can I ask you a
Latin
question,
America.
Helena? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
'Cause you're the expert in international law. You and Charlie are. I'm not. International law doesn't entitle a country to interfere with the internal affairs of another one because it says that the electoral process has been corrupt, does it?
No, I mean the sad fact is that there are bad guys like you know, like Maduro in many places. I mean, Putin didn't exactly, you know, gets 90% of the electorate voting for him. Are those fair elections? He throws people into jail and captures the judiciary just in the same way. And yet here we are with the president of the United States, hugger with the president of Russia. I mean, Maduro, the badness of the guy and the fact that they may have stolen an election, I'm afraid is not in international law a good reason to go in there and capture him and then take him up for trial.
I agree with that completely. But what the Americans, as I understand it, say, he was, quote, their language, a narco-terrorist. A judicial process has issued some sort of indictment against him with 45 charges. The charges relate to America. He flooded America with cocaine because it is said in the indictment he was at the head of a specific drugs cartel. Question, Does that justify, as a matter of international law, Americans sending in bombers and military personnel in helicopters to seize Maduro from his presidential palace?
Listen, sending in people and capturing people. I mean, for example, it was done for the war criminal by Israel. In Argentina, you'll remember. Yeah. Eichmann. I mean, these things have been done, and the world, the sort of usually the moral approach of the world determines whether one turns a blind eye to the way in which a thing is done. I'm afraid that I feel very deeply concerned about what's happening in the Trump regime because of the general disregard for the rule of law, both internally, domestically, and internationally, the complete disregard for international law. So I mean, I think that we should be concerned.
But there's been a precedent for this.
Just to be clear,
sorry, there's been a precedent for this.
Just to be clear, just hold on, just wait a minute. Just to be clear, we should be clear, should we not, that you can't send in troops to remove somebody, even though he may. There may be there are extradition processes, and if there's no extradition treaty, you can't use armed force to go into another country and take the person who claims, maybe wrongly, to be the president of that country. It is the use of force against Venezuela that is only authorized in international law in certain limited circumstances, and one of those circumstances is not because you want to enforce the US's criminal law in Venezuela.
But Charlie, there's a precedent for this.
Charlie, absolutely. But before you go to precedent, and I know that the one that you're going to mention, but before you go to precedent, Charlie is absolutely right that you're not permitted in international law because you don't like the guy and because he does do bad things, and that they actually even might reach into your nation. There are ways in which you can do this, in that you use the United Nations. You get other countries in the region to be supportive of you in an intervention of that kind when you know that someone is running drugs through their country and then into another country. Although let's remember that all the story that we kept hearing was not relating to cocaine. It was relating to other forms of drugs which do not go through this particular route. So there's been a sleight of hand around the story, the narrative that was given about what this guy was up to. And let's just remember at this moment in time that the President of the United States has just released another Latin American president from Honduras who was serving time in American jails for the very same thing, being a narco-terrorist, and he's just been released from just and pardoned by the president. What's that all about? If not, and does it not smell of hypocrisy? I mean, what I'm concerned about here is I don't think an awful lot is being said about doing this because of the great concern for the people of Venezuela. He's been absolutely using the most horrible language about the people of Venezuela flooding the United States of America, and some of them actually being sent off to El Salvador to those terrible prisons. But let's be clear, he's not saying that he's doing this in the interests of the people of Venezuela. He's saying he's doing it in the interest of the people of the United States of America, and I'm sure that will play very well. And I'm sure that they would like to get cocaine reduced in the quantities as it's going through the United States. Although I'm sure that plenty of those guys that finance Trump are users of cocaine. However, I just want to say that I do think that this is really about the oil that is available in Venezuela. But
can you answer my question? Can you answer my question?
What was your question?
Noriega was subjected to exactly the same treatment. He was accused of being a narco-terrorist. The Americans sent forces in. They captured him eventually after he'd holed up in the embassy of the Vatican. And they got him out by playing Black Sabbath very loudly, didn't they? They got him out. But the Americans have maintained that this was entirely legitimate, and no court or body has ever said that what they did was contrary to international law. So they say, what's wrong with this one?
Well, the Noriega one was equally a breach of international law, Because the question is, I think we're agreed that there was no legitimization, no international law legitimacy in using force to take out Maduro from Venezuela. But then what's the remedy? They could go to the United Nations Security Council, who could condemn it as a breach of international law. But that's obviously not going to work because the United States of America would veto any Security Council resolution. They could go to the International Court of Justice. How would that go? Helena, you help us on that.
Well, the thing about we all, I mean, I don't know if you remember your responses to what happened to Noriega. But we all despised the whole Contra thing, and were deeply critical of the United States. At least we all. I mean, certainly people in my circle were deeply critical of all of that. And we do know that the United States has always sort of swaggered a sort of distance from these international ways of reckoning with criminality. They have thrown blocks in its way often when it comes to their own conduct. So, I mean, that doesn't come as a surprise. The big thing that is underpinning this is a move, I think, a shift that's taking place, before our eyes, which is a sort of new world order in which he's saying, this is my backyard, and I will determine. I'm the big guy in it. This is my schoolyard where I can be the bully, and it's giving permission to Putin and indeed to Xi that, to some extent, they should back off, and he wants no criticism from them because he will allow them the same latitude when they come to do the same things in their arena. And I think that Taiwan, I certainly feel that Ukraine should be feeling very, very concerned about all of this. And I don't think this would have been possible if it had not been that there was some assistance given to Mr. Trump by his friend, Mr. Putin. Because, you see, Venezuela is a sort of it belongs to Russia in many ways. Russia has been supporting it in terms of arms and in terms in many other ways. And so I think that there probably has been some assistance given in the backing off and also in the response of the generals. You see, the thing about Venezuela, as I understand it, is that it's not just that there's some guy at the top who determines everything, and once you take the head off the snake, then that somehow it might change. There are more generals in Venezuela than you could count. There are vast numbers of generals, and all of them have a sphere of influence. All of them have something that they run. Some of them run the agricultural bit, and some of them run the ports or the industrial systems. They all have responsibility for different things. They all have their own little empires. And so there's a bigger thing than pulling in Maduro. That's going to have to deal with, do any of them step forward, basically to take Maduro's place? But do they become sort of, if you like, rather than belonging to Putin, they belong to Trump? Or are you going to have to deal with all those other forces that operate in the land? Because it's a much broader thing than just one dictator at the top. And so I think this is much more complicated. What happens next is going to be deeply important. And he's already indicated he doesn't want the woman who actually stood in the election, who was the leader of the opposition and who's won the Nobel Prize. He's made a clear indication that he doesn't think that she's got enough support, and he's not going to be backing her. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to say I agree. I agree. It is really important what happens next. I don't know what is going to happen next, but the question of the extent to which this becomes a massive issue does depend on, inverted commas, the result, doesn't it? So suppose the position were, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, and generally these sorts of things don't happen, if Venezuela degenerates into some sort of absolute basket case because of what happened over the weekend, then everybody will condemn this as the most appalling breach of international law. And that's what happens when you break international law. And Iraq is the obvious thought in people's mind. But suppose the consequence, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if it's an in and it's an out, Venezuela genuinely takes over its affairs very, very quickly. It transits to what we would regard as a legitimate democracy. Its oil industry begins to thrive again. It becomes a very successful, prosperous place, as it was when Nicholas's family lived there. Both democracy and prosperity return to Venezuela as a result of the removal of Maduro. And I take all the points you've made, Helena, that Maduro is not, as it were, the only reason for what's happened to Venezuela. Then how will people look at it? Because ultimately, international law is very frequently judged in retrospect by the success or failure of the particular foreign policy move that took place.
Well, Libya. I
think you'd find
listen,
going back.
Let's remember, it's not. The last. They keep saying that this is the first intervention for I don't know how many 30 odd years, but certainly we had the business of intervention in Libya, and there's another basket case. I mean, and Europe has reaped the consequence of all of that, because there's so much corruption there that a lot of the boats that end up going into the Mediterranean carrying people from further, from other parts of Africa, are being transited through Libya into Europe. I mean, Libya is not a success story, and that was done under the Obama administration. Although he did have the support of Europe and so on, and he did go about it in a rather he did go about it in a rather different way. You see, if here you'd had, also let's remember, Congress has not been involved in this either. I mean, we have, a rogue president here who pays very little attention to what the norms are, even in the United States, in how you go about this kind of thing. And the story is,
you say a rogue president. I mean, there's a constant debate in America about whether or not the president can, on his own back, use force. He can't declare war without Congress saying it. But if it's just, quote, a raid and not a prolonged campaign, then presidents have always argued, like in relation to Noriega, like in relation to Trump here, like in relation to initially what happened in Vietnam. These were things the presidents all argued they could do off their own bat. And that's an unresolved issue, because the president's the commander-in-chief. Congress is the only body that has the power to declare war. Which is it here? Again, though, what is the remedy? Everything depends on the decisions made by the president, and whether it be under international law or whether it be under domestic US law, there is very little check on his ability to use force. And honestly, both as yeah. Nicholas, do you have a view on that?
I agree. They smartly are putting this under the rubric of dealing with crime, rather than and that there were, the indictments in existence. Let me tell you, they're quite old indictments. They're not just drawn up in the last week or so. These have been hanging around for quite a while. But you'd have to put it into the context of what's happened in this last month, with the whole business of bombing vessels that he claimed were carrying narcotics from A to B, and basically in your part of the world, the Caribbean, there's been quite a lot of serious fear and disruption. Of course, there will be a great deal of admiration, I think, probably across the whole of America, saying, well, look at our troops, aren't they fantastic? You can't get a better team of, special forces than this, that they did it in the night, that they were able to turn out all the lights, that they were able to, and that they'd been obviously. Now, the idea is that this intelligence was being gathered. I suspect a lot of that intelligence would have come internally, and it might even have come via Putin. But I have no basis for saying that. It's just that I have my suspicions, because I think that Ukraine is about to be sold down the river, and the basis for that is, you let me do my business in my backyard, and you can do what you like in your backyard. And I think that there's a sort of.
Can I make the answer to question?
Nicholas, yes.
Can I just say this? I think this episode has just reinforced my view that international law is almost a sort of oxymoron. It's international law. International law in the eyes of the Americans is they do what they want when they want, and they don't comply with any rules.
And it's not just. The sad thing about this is that there have always been people who've done what they want, and Russia was not observant of international law either. There are other authoritarian governments that ignore international obligations, and China has certainly ignored international law. So, I mean, it's not just America. It's just that we expected more of America.
We did.
We're entitled to feel that the United States is now actually degrading
The government of law is
in the
not
eyes
men.
of the world.
Government of law is not men.
The
It's
interesting
going back,
thing,
isn't it? America's going back to the 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine was that in the Western Hemisphere, America had hegemony.
Yeah.
And in his recent national security statement, in effect, President Trump has reiterated the Monroe Doctrine, which is we will not allow any force that is not pro-America to coexist in any strength in the Western Hemisphere. That means in the Americas, from Canada down to the end of South America. And this is a representative of the Monroe Doctrine. So it's not new, it's old, isn't it?
Yes. Except I want to just have a little poke at that, because that's the rhetoric, and there is this business of you leave me to my backyard. I think that is going on, but I think there are certain places. I think that Greenland and Taiwan and places should be sort of somewhat anxious, having watched all this going on. However, the hypocrisy of this is that it's not stopped the United States interfering in the business of Europe, where it's very much backing extreme right-wing parties in Germany, in France, and indeed here. Farage is in Washington all the time, and he is getting backing from any number of groups, and he'll be getting funding and getting all kinds of support. And part of the deal, and will be getting, I suspect, steers on the things that the United States doesn't want, and so you can look forward to horribly fattened beef and poultry washed in formaldehyde or something. There are things that Trump wants, and one of the major things is they want to deregulate social media and so on. They don't want any regulation. They're furious with the European Union, and they want to actually really to sort of dismantle.
Can I just conclude?
Sure. Yeah, Nicholas.
I just want us to discuss very briefly, because this is important. Does Maduro have a defense that he's been unlawfully brought before the American courts? I mean, if he'd been brought by the SES before an English court, the prosecution would be struck out, wouldn't it, as being an abuse of process?
It would be, and there's a case to that effect.
Yes, but
what about America, Nicholas? You've looked at the law.
Let me just say that in the United States of America, that will not run. The United States of America is the invoking of international law in the domestic courts is not a winner in the United States of America, and so I don't believe
it's not a breach of surely it's a breach of
domestic law.
Domestic law, isn't it? What happens if you're domestically? Nicholas, you've looked at this. Tell us. If you're arrested unlawfully in America, is that a defense to a criminal trial?
No, but in America, a bad arrest doesn't invalidate a good detention. So they don't have the same law as us. We have very good law. If you were arrested unlawfully, abducted, brought to this country, your claim, the prosecution will be struck out as an abuse. But they don't have that. And indeed, because Noriega ran that very argument, and it was said,
The argument surely the argument that he's going to run, though, is that if there was stuff going on involving narcotics coming from Colombia, basically, but they're saying up through Venezuela, and that he was an enabler, he'll say, I knew nothing about it. If that was going on, that was no business of mine. And he's going to say, this is basically an allegation that's being made against me in order to remove me from my position as leader, and basically to disrupt and to enable a different kind of regime to exist, which is going to be much more beneficial to the United States of America. And it was done for political reasons. I mean, that's what his lawyers will be arguing on his behalf, that this was basically motivated by political impetus rather than by...
Helena, do you remember with Pinochet? Pinochet argued that he was immune because he was a former president. I mean, why can't Maduro argue that he's immune under whatever the customary...
There'll undoubtedly be arguments around immunity, but we'll see how that...
Well, it's been a very, very interesting pod today, and we're right on the cusp of what's going to happen in relation to international. I don't think any of us are disagreeing that it's obviously a breach of international
Well,
law. I don't
I
think any of
see,
us are disagreeing that it's.
but I think
No,
the reason
keep
why
going. Yeah.
it's important for lawyers and people to be thinking about this is because I think that this is yet another nail in the coffin of international law, and that's my fear. Yes, it will carry on, and places in Europe and so on will seek to adhere as much as possible to the principles that were put together, in the creation of international courts and international standards. But once you abandon a sense of what is fundamental to the rule of law, to due process, to the right ways of doing things that provide justice. Once you abandon all of that, I mean, I'm afraid the world is going to be a more dangerous and more violent place. You'll get more of this kind of stuff going on, and I think that we should be very anxious about what this will do to democracy around the world.
I agree. And I mean, the people in America might well be thinking, well, who cares if it's a breach of international law if it makes the world a safer place? That's what they think in America. It makes the world a safer place because you get rid of a very bad actor in Venezuela. And if it works out, would they be right?
Listen, I hope for the people of Venezuela. I mean, going back to Nicholas's boyhood with his parents living the life of Riley there. I think that the problem was there was a great deal of poverty in Venezuela. In the old order, there were people, the middle classes and the upper middle classes did incredibly well, but a lot of people were poor and were exploited and did not do well, and that's what gave rise to the sort of the revolutionary governments that came into being.
Chavez.
Chavez, and
that's
then
what led to Chavez.
And Maduro in turn, and so Chavez came in, and a lot of people watching from outside thought, well, this might bring a great deal more fairness and sharing of the great resources of Venezuela across the piece. But unfortunately, he got involved in all the sort of ghastly things that authoritarians do by throwing people in jail, disappearing people, bumping off his opponents, and trying to capture the judiciary, and indeed did manage to do it in the most heinous ways. So, I mean, the unfortunate thing is you get authoritarians at both ends of the spectrum, and at the moment the ascendancy is on the right.